Hi everyone, this is Hardy Fowler, creator of Digital Painting Studio. Welcome to the Alien Priestess project. This is a quick demo project to give you all a look at my process for creating really cool character and creature artwork. For full courses on these subjects and tons of other amazing digital art resources, check us out at digitalpaintingstudio.com. But for now, let's grab our stylus and dive in. So the blank canvas is always the trickiest part of any piece, so let's just dive in and start making marks. So for our project here, I'm going to do kind of an alien priestess. We're going to call this character Priestess. So a female alien, kind of a mystical quality. I want her to seem very magical, kind of a quiet power, very intelligent, soulful eyes will be a really huge selling point for this one. But I just want her to have a very mystic, magical quality about her. So with my rough sketch phase, I'm just trying to establish some basic attitude and details, kind of answering all of those big picture questions about what I want this character's story to be, what's going to be interesting and memorable about this character. So just some basic pose ideas sketching out here. Just using my brush tool, I've got a layer set to kind of low opacity, but I'm painting with black. I like doing this since it sort of feels like a pencil sketch, something that's not really permanent. For some reason, it just frees me up to make as many stray marks as I want, just have a very loose and expressive process, because that's all we're really doing here is getting ideas out there. So don't want anything to limit us, just feel very free. Let the ideas flow and come to a cool idea. So getting a basic pose together, kind of got that basic alien almond-shaped head with those very large expressive eyes. Again, I envision those being a really cool selling point for this character. Very communicative and wise and soulful. Exploring some different ideas on what I can do with her head shape to make them kind of cool, and starting to think I might want some kind of tentacle-looking hair, some kind of hair type feature blowing in the wind, but I'm actually going to expand that out a little bit. Not quite tentacle hairs coming off of her head, but sort of these very loose strand looking things, kind of like sea kelp, I guess is the texture I have in mind. Something that looks a lot like human hair, but will be creative and distinctively alien. So it does all the cool things that blowing hair does for a human character. It makes him look very epic and dramatic, gives the image a lot of dynamism and movement, but at the same time it's something cool and alien looking that it might not have been expected. So always looking for those opportunities, both to use all these tricks that we use for human character design, but also to make something new and interesting and alien looking. So that's what I'm going for here. Now, other than the face, the hands are often the most expressive part of any character or creature for that matter. So I'm really taking my time on the pose for these hands, kind of these upside down mirrored versions of the same hand, as if she's casting some kind of spell or summoning some kind of alien magic on us. So that's what I'm going for there. And working on defining her shoulder contours here and this sort of cloak robe thing she'll be wearing. But not really getting too worried about any details right now, just sort of establishing general proportions, her pose, her shape, her general wardrobe, and it's really coming together nicely. I've also got the idea of adding these kind of floating large blocky elements to her costume behind her, sort of like the Protoss in StarCraft. They all have all kinds of cool geometric shapes kind of floating and rotating around them. So I don't want to be too reminiscent of a Protoss warrior or anything, but I think that would be a cool fit here. So adding in these little geometric shapes that'll be sort of floating behind her as if held up by her magic power. So adding some story elements just to make her seem a little more interesting, really back up that whole idea that she's commanding some kind of invisible magic force. And I think it's looking really cool. Sort of starting to think about some costuming details, little trinkets and wraps that could be hanging around her neck and shoulders, just things to make her seem very mystic and interesting. And I'm actually going to just copy these hands. I think they're working pretty well, so I'm going to use those as a jump off point for this second set of arms I'll be adding out to the side. So another kind of interesting element is we're going to give her two pairs of arms, something that will make her distinctively not human, although her face and hair, I think, are already selling us on that, but just one of those cool little details to make something memorable and interesting. So going with 4 arms here, certainly something that's been done before, but doesn't mean it's going to be anything boring if we use it again here. So always feel free to be inspired by other designs, but just make sure you're coming up with something new and creative by the end product, and I think will certainly fall well within that. So just sort of starting to refine the line work a little bit. I've got my basic idea and even my basic pose head to toe just about established here, but it's time to refine things just a little bit before we're done with this. After we're done with our rough sketch phase, up next we'll ink this in, kind of do a second line art pass just to really refine things. But we're getting very close. To go along with her blowing hair, I think I'm going to add some little kind of kilt-like bands drooping down from her belt, other things that can blow in the wind, kind of add movement and dynamism, and of course make her seem like she's floating with her magical power. But just notice that the hair and those elements are blowing in different directions, so we have to have a consistent wind direction. That's why I just flipped that. But with that, a few more details, and I think this sketch is just about done. A very cool basic pose, lots of interesting background story, and a great framework upon which to base a really cool rendering later on. So we've got our basic character in place. Now that our sketch is just about finished, up next we'll do an inking pass. So with this, I'm going to create a new layer on top and just call it ink. And with this one, I'm painting with 100% black. I usually just use the default Photoshop round brush for this, just to give it some really nice crisp line work. But on this pass, we're definitely honing in, making our brush strokes much more defined and crisp, very bold, deliberate movements of the stylus here. And that does a good job of both refining our idea, and it just makes everything look a lot more crisp and defined. You can't just sort of lose things in vague, sketchy areas anymore. You really have to have all these decisions made. So this really helps you out in later painting steps. And it also just makes things look nice. If you're doing this as a professional project or even as student work, this is a great phase to give a nice professional presentation of an early idea. That way you haven't gone into a full painting or anything before submitting this to approval. So send a nice inked line drawing to a client to see if the idea is what they wanted, or a teacher to see if it's approved to continue to a final painting. That way you sort of limit your risk. You don't want to have any final paintings done and have a client or a teacher just say, nope, this is not what we were after. So a good intermediate step, and it gives it a really nice polished presentation look for an early phase. So basically we're just tracing, guys. We kind of have to go head to toe around every little element that we defined in our sketch and give it a nice crisp treatment. Now I'm copying here, cheating a little bit, making life easy, and just sort of making one side that's symmetrical with the other just flip right over to the other side. So Photoshop makes things so much easier than traditional medium for all kinds of things, but that's just one of my favorites, being able to copy and paste elements that are similar. So even these hands, I'm doing a little bit of interior line detailing just for those little wrinkles around the palms, but we don't want to over describe with our line art. It's actually kind of easy to overdo this inking step. If you end up with too many lines, all kinds of little crosshatch marks, it ends up being kind of such a mess that it doesn't look good, or at least that's my experience. So I like to be pretty sparse with my line art, very clean, and leave a lot of white space, just as many lines as you need to communicate all the shapes and forms, but nothing too over rendered, especially on a face. If you had too many lines, you'd be surprised. Sometimes your faces can end up looking weirdly overly wrinkled, like it's somebody who's very old or a zombie or something. So really show some restraint with that line art, and I think you'll be very pleased. So I'm dialing that underlying sketch layer way back just so that I can barely see it now, because as you can see, the ink phase is starting to stand up pretty well on its own. I even created a new layer to do some of these cloth wrinkles just to have those on their own layer so that I could erase away without worrying about my other ink work here. adding a little bit of interior detail just to define some of these materials, but I think for the most part, this is pretty well inked up and is starting to look really nice. Just a few more little details, and I think we'll be ready to block this guy in. So up next, we'll use this layer to create a silhouetted blocked in shape, and that's how we'll begin our painting. But before we do that, I'm actually going to use the marquee tools to make these perfect circles that will sit behind the rest of the ink drawing. So rather than trying to very carefully sketch out a perfect circle, just stroke those marquee selection shapes and it'll work just like that. So with a few transformations, you can see it makes this incredibly easy. I think we can call that a finished ink drawing. So up next, we're going to start our value painting, but first we're going to have to block this in, and we'll actually use our ink layer for that, as we did in both creature and character painting. So once we've got our figure nice and silhouetted in, we can start our value painting. And remember, you can use the silhouette layer anytime by command clicking on it, and it will create a selection for you. So value is often my favorite part. It's where we really start to make our character or creature look three-dimensional. It's where they really start coming to life. This is a lot of fun. So with value, remember, we have to keep light and dark in mind. That's very important. We have to remember where our light source is. So I'm thinking sort of upper left for this character, and I'm going to make sure that everything is very consistent with that. And with a value painting, it's really just as simple as the planes of the shape that you're trying to render, the ones that are facing the light source, need to be higher in value. So I'm making more marks, kind of tapping more brush strokes in the areas where it's facing the light source. And on the opposite end of that, the areas that are facing away from the light source, I'll leave darker. So this is an additive process. We're adding light tones where we want that light source to shine. And as you can see, we've already really started to define this character's face is something three-dimensional. Now, just as important as light sourcing and value is something called value edges. That's something that really makes a creature or character look organic and realistic. Now, what I mean by that is we have lots of nice smooth gradations where the light fades to dark over a long area, kind of a nice smooth gradient. But what we also need to balance that out is areas where light turns to dark very quickly, stark changes from high value to low value. And you can see that on this character's lips especially. That upper lip is in shadow and it's very dark, but there's almost a stark line where it switches to almost a highest key value right below those lips. So where those two lines come together, it sort of defines these different forms. Those stark changes from light to dark, mixed in with the soft gradients as well, is what makes this face seem like a living thing. An amateur mistake that you see very often is somebody who has only soft value edges. That especially makes digital art look really photoshoppy and kind of computer generated. It doesn't have that nice painterly look that we're trying to achieve. That's because artists who are new to the digital medium have probably struggled most of their lives to get traditional media to look nice and smooth. So suddenly they have all of these computer tools available to them, and it's really hard to resist making all of those nice smooth marks that you've been trying to achieve your whole life traditionally. But you have to show some restraint and not just use those really fun smooth strokes. You have to use those stark value edges as well. So that balance is really the key to how I've always been able to find a good bit of success making realistic and realistically organic looking characters and creatures with this step. Now, you've also probably noticed that we're just using this bright orange color. In my process, we've got a really nice way of separating color and value. So we can do the value rendering first. It's basically just doing light and dark. You could do this in black and white if you wanted, because we're just going to convert this to skin tones in our next step. But it allows us to worry about just one thing at a time. So for now, we're just worrying about a cool value, light and dark painting here, just to make this creature or character look very three-dimensional and realistic and organic. So worrying about one thing at a time here. So rendering in this hair type material, I guess I'll just call it hair, and trying to make it sort of the same material as her skin. I think that'll be kind of cool if it's sort of the same thing, like it just grows right out of her face, made of whatever kind of alien textured skin we're going to end up giving her later on. So also notice that I'm jumping from the brush tool to the smudge tool fairly often, just kind of hitting B and R as my keyboard shortcuts. I like adding in tones by using both a low opacity and low brush flow and just tapping lots and lots of times. It kind of makes this built up textured look of lots of semi-opaque tones on top of each other. It ends up making things look nice and mottled and irregular and helps you avoid that overly smooth look that again really shows an amateur digital artist. So that's what I'm doing here for my brush work. But you don't want things to be so mottled and textured that they're distracting. So especially on the face and with a female character, I wanted things to look kind of smooth and soft edged. So I use the smudge tool for that, just to sort of blend away anything that's too textured. But you can certainly overdo it, so show some restraint there. I don't want to lose all the cool textured brush work that we've worked so hard to achieve here. So a little bit of smudging just to refine things, always a nice idea, but don't overdo it. For my brush, I'm just using the standard Photoshop chalk brush. That's my default. You can see it in the upper left there. Not many special dynamics set on this one. It's just basically a brush with pen pressure set to brush diameter so that we can go from nice thick and thin, have a lot of control over how large our marks are based on the pen pressure that I'm using. And I set it usually around 20 or 30%, both flow and opacity, and I just tap multiple times to build up these light value tones. So it gives you tons of control. You can start very slowly, adding just some barely lighter tones, and then just build up until you get these really high key values, as you see in some of the brighter parts of our painting here. So for our design, notice I'm trying to work in a little bit of asymmetry wherever I can, especially since these hands are basically mirror images. I thought it would be cool to have kind of a long sleeve on one and a short sleeve on the other. And I want to show a little bit of skin too. I think it's going to be cool if I can add tattoos or something later on, just to sort of reinforce that mystic quality to our design, but also just a cool design idea to keep things a little bit asymmetrical sometimes, makes them a little more interesting. So giving her some abdominal muscles here. These are mostly going to be in shadow, but I want a little bit of that to show, just to show some kind of cool alien anatomy. Notice I've got some sort of not exactly human musculature going on there, again, just to make it seem interesting and not exactly human. And I'm using that with value edges. Again, see this that we have both soft gradations and hard edges where each one of those little muscle cuts is occurring. Makes her look kind of ripped, like she has really toned abs, and that's what we're going for. So a little bit of skin work down here on the feet, a little more value painting, and I think we're going to be ready to convert this to skin tones up next. And I've got a super cool, super easy technique for converting to skin tones, so that once we're done worrying about value in this step, we're going to start worrying about color and making her skin look really cool. So a little bit of detail work on the feet, and I think we're ready. So up next, I'm just going to hit Command U, which will do a hue saturation adjustment. That's one of the coolest adjusters to let you easily change color in Photoshop. So I'm going to make a copy of this value layer just as a safety net, and by hitting Command U, I've shifted things much more yellow and also lighter in tone. And I've created a new layer under that value painting, and I'm just painting in some red in certain areas. I want the skin tones to have a nice modulation. I want it to be warmer in some areas, but leave it cool. Let that dark cyan silhouette show through. So areas like lips and fingertips, I'd like them to be a little bit redder. So I think that's a nice modulation. I'm just going to call this skin, and I'm doing some color balance adjustments just to see what looks cool, trying something a little more icy blue, and then using the history brush to erase back to when I had that nice sort of pink fingertips and lips. And as you can see, we're getting a nice skin tone quality where the lips and cheeks have a little bit of red flush quality to them, but the rest of it is kind of nice and cool. So that modulation is what makes something seem like real skin rather than just plastic of a certain color. You got to have those variations in hue. So I've merged those layers together, and now I'm just jumping around and refining things. Basically, I'm just using my brush tool, and if you hit the Alt or Option key if you're using Mac, you can pick up the colors that you see. It switches your brush tool to the medicine dropper tool. You can see that whenever I hit the Alt key, it's actually sampling the colors underneath. So I'm just sort of jumping all over the place, picking it up and laying it back down. This is a really cool, easy way to sort of refine things, make everything start to homogenize a little bit, make it nice and cohesive, but also add a few little details. I've kind of got some freckles on her cheeks there that look pretty cool. And same thing, really head to toe. We need to refine everything. Most of these skin tones look pretty nice and believable, but it's sort of just a baseline. We've got to really go around and polish everything up and make it look as cool as we can. Also adding some shadows to some of these darker areas. With this additive value process, sometimes you can forget to leave shadows as we need to. So using the history brush here just to erase away some of these high values. Really want that hand to stick out against the dark shadowed part of her abdomen beneath. But with that, I think we have our skin tone step just about finished. So up next, we're going to give her some really cool looking eyes. So I'm going to zoom way in. This is going to be some detailed work. And I'm going to start some new layers. First, I want to give her eyes a nice dark background just to sort of define them from the rest of the face. And that's actually kind of terrifying already. So I definitely want her eyes to be more soulful. Don't necessarily want this to be an evil looking character. But with eyes, we want them to have a very jeweled looking lighting scheme. And I've got a specific process for that. Basically, all you have to keep in mind is that light needs to be lighter at the bottom side. If we imagine her eye as a sphere, we want it to be darker near the top and brighter near the bottom. It's because the light goes through the clear lens of the eye and it bounces around inside. It kind of refracts, so it has to be darker near the top and lighter near the bottom. It'll look like that light is sort of in shadow, as if her brow was sort of shading that top part of her iris and letting the light only hit that bottom part. And as you can see, it already starts to look really deep and interesting. And I'm adding all kinds of little striations and smudging out some really cool little lines inside of there. If you go look in the mirror at your own iris, there's some incredibly cool stuff going on in there. So try and mimic that. But just remember the top part of the eye needs to be relatively in shadow, and then the bottom part is all light. So our brightest brights with this gold color is near the bottom. And just smudging out, refining things, maybe giving that pupil sort of an interesting non-human shape. But I think that's really cool looking. Certainly the soulful quality that I'm going for. Eyes are so cool. They communicate so much. And with this character, they're going to be a really important part of getting her personality across, making her seem very soulful and intelligent, very wise, but also want her looking pretty stern. She's confidently staring right at us, not scared of anything, and as if she could just impose her will. So tons of personality comes out when you're rendering eyes, and certainly a cool opportunity for some interesting creature design when you're doing a non-human character like this. So I think we've got that jewel lighting scheme worked pretty well here. I'm going to experiment with some different colors just to see what works best in a minute. But up next, this is the coolest part, is right where the pupil and the iris meet, so the little hole in the middle, we're going to put a really bright, almost pure white highlight. It's what makes the eye seem really jeweled and soulful. So once I'm done refining this iris, I'll create a new layer on top. And that's where we're going to do that highlight. But first we want to make sure everything's nicely polished, make sure it looks good from far out. And I think we're just about there. This is looking very cool. Some interesting iris details. Very nice. So next, right where the pupil and the iris meet, we just put this one little dot or a few little marks to show that little shiny highlight. And just like that, that's always the moment when these characters seem to just come to life, is when that highlight shows up. makes him look so realistic and soulful. Moving things around just to make sure that that eye is looking exactly where I want to. Don't want her looking cross-eyed or anything, so be careful there. And also moving this highlight around a little just to make sure that's right where I want it. But as long as that highlight spans both the dark pupil and the iris, it will make it look all deep and jeweled like we want. And I think that's perfect. Wow, just like that, suddenly it looks like we're really looking at a creature that's staring out at us. So super cool. I've kept this on a layer so that I could do a hue saturation adjustment and see if there are any colors that I like better. They kind of all look cool actually, but I think I'm going to stick with that mostly gold look. But I'm switching this to a blue so that I can erase back with the history brush, just to have a few little hints of blue and color modulation in there to give it a little bit of interesting color tone. But with that, I think we just about have a finished pair of eyes. Looking great. Moving on. Up next, we'll start tackling the cloth, some of these costume elements. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is sort of define everywhere that is this big cloak shape. And I've done a little bit of off-camera experimentation to decide on a color scheme, and I think I'm going to go with something kind of bold here. Do a really bright yellow, very intense color for this main cloak that she's wearing. I think it should really go very well with her muted kind of cool skin tones. I think it'll be a nice contrast. So I try to use color pretty restrained. I usually make most of my artwork very muted in color scheme and just save that really bright, intense, saturated color for some certain area of interest. So we're kind of doing that here. We're saving our brightest, most saturated tones for an area of interest. But on the whole, this is going to be quite a bit brighter than I usually do. So basically, I've been blocking in this cloak so that I could use it as a suggestion. There's a lot of overlap with her hands in front of her there, so I wanted to do that just to make life a little bit easier so that I could command click that layer and just use it as a selection whenever I need it. So erasing away some parts where I want it to be a darker kind of wrap, but on this cloth layer, I've command clicked that layer, so I'm only working within that selection that I made, that we defined by tracing everything. And I'm going to start rendering in some cloth. Now, if you've taken our character painting course, you know we have a really easy way to render cloth. It's basically just a couple of brush strokes, kind of zigzag shapes wherever cloth bunches up, kind of Z-shaped strokes, and then long, smooth strokes if there's a large area of cloth that sort of all pinches together in a common place. It's kind of like a vanishing point. You do a lot of smooth strokes in that area. So certainly both here, with this long flowing cloak, we definitely have a lot of those long smooth strokes where the cloak is sort of all gathering towards a common spot. But we also have some zigzag shapes where the cloth is kind of bunching up, like we see on her arm, sort of that area where her hands are lifting the cloth up just a little bit. All part of cloth and drapery dynamics that we explore in a lot more detail elsewhere in character and creature design courses here on the site. So I hope you'll check those out if you haven't already. Doing a little bit of smoothing with the brush tool and also doing a little bit of extra brush work just to make sure that that cloth texture can stay fairly smooth. I don't want it to be super mottled. Otherwise, it'll start looking like skin if we give it that same kind of brush treatment. But as you can see with a little bit of value work, I've actually made it look like that cloth between her legs has sort of got a twist to it. So we're seeing a dark side and two light sides. So that adds a ton of movement and dynamism when you can imagine these little bits of cloth or her hair as well kind of twisting in the wind. So I've carefully used the value to get that point across, make it look like they're really blowing. You can almost see them move. That's what we're trying to create. And doing a little bit of fine smudging here just to kind of define some of these areas where the cloth comes into contact with some of these little wrap and jewel bits that we're going to add in later. And now I'm going to sort of go around all of these edges and just add a very bright highlight just to sort of define those cloth edges. You can add some little details like little tattered edges, but a cool detail to add. So jumping ahead just a little bit, we've got our wraps defined. I've done a little bit of color adjustment. So now I'm going to come back on top of this these wraps and sort of render them in. I want these to stay fairly dark, so I'm just using a very dark gray treatment here. And I want this to look kind of braided, like it's woven together, especially this collar part. I think that would look really cool, and that's coming out well. So I want it to look like she's got these interesting sort of sorceress wraps going on around her cloak. So I added a few extra little lines going away. I thought those were interesting, and some little detailed, showing some tattered edges. Don't want everything to look super clean and polished. I want her to look like she's kind of got old and weathered looking stuff. Thinks it makes her more interesting and fits with the whole mystic quality that we're trying to give this character. So same kind of overlapping alien looking braids going on her sleeve, and I'm going to try and carry that down to her leg wraps as well. So her whole lower body is kind of made of this material, so I'm trying to make it look fairly interesting and braided, just so that it's not a big afterthought kind of boring area. Oftentimes, if you're working head to toe, as I often do, legs and feet can end up being an afterthought, and later when you look at your project, you'll kind of realize that you wish you had put a little more time in on the legs and feet. So just remember, take a break, save some artistic energy for the end, just so that you don't end up regretting kind of not showing your best work on all parts of the character. So a little tip there, so a trap I fall into often, and just find that a quick break really can help you out of that. So with a little more rendering on the legs, I think she's looking pretty well rendered head to toe in terms of her skin and her clothes. I think that's coming together really nicely. So for the rest of the project, we're basically going to be adding little cool details and polish. So this is sort of the fun stuff from here on out. Now I've created a new layer and called it metal, and I'm just rendering in a little area of shiny metal. And I'm going to do a very lazy, awesome technique here of just using the clone stamp. I've sampled that metal area that we rendered off to the side, and I'm just sort of stamping in these little trinkets that I want to kind of be hanging on her little wraps on her cloak here, just to give her some interest. Also down here on her belt, kind of part of what's holding that little kilt thing on, and just refining that a little bit. But a super easy way to drop in a ton of little metal trinket details, and I think this phase is looking great. So up next, we're going to add some photo textures. Now, digital artists often rely too heavily on real photographs for their art, so we're not going to use these as a crutch, just as a subtle way to add a little bit of interest, and I've got a really cool technique for how to do this. So let's check it out. I've pasted in 3 that I use all the time. This dart frog, a pattern colored skirt, and actually this thing at the top is just the inside of an elevator that I saw. So these 3 I've gotten so much mileage out of, and check them out on the site. They're available for download. But the dart frog's got all these cool spots, works great for monsters or any kind of alien. So what we're going to do is use each of these to create actually a new layer set. So I've pasted that first one, and I'm going to hit Command G and make it into a group, and I'll call this Photo Textures. So each one of those is going to end up inside of this. We're going to mask this group out, so we Command click on our character's silhouette, and we hit this mask icon. As you can see, now this photo only exists inside of the silhouette of our figure because it's masked out. So I'm actually going to add these circle shapes behind it to that mask. So I want that to be able to fit only inside of our silhouette. And I'm going to switch this whole group to soft light. Very important. That's the secret to this whole thing, is this soft light blending mode. And as you can see, it shows all of these awesome textures from this photograph, but it also lets all of our really cool rendering show through as well. So it sort of just adds a little bit of flavor from that photo texture to our illustration without totally dominating it and taking over. So that really takes it to a whole other level of detail and refinement when you've got all these cool little texture items going on inside. So what I'm doing is just pasting in these photos from my photo layer group one at a time and just transforming them around the image. They'll never go outside the lines because we've got that whole layer group masked out. And I'm just sort of clone stamping things around, kind of splashing this texture wherever I think it'll work. And I think that fabric print looks super cool on the cloth parts here. So making that all work. But that weird interior elevator texture looks super cool in her hair, and really got to find the best spot for each texture. It's easy to get carried away and use one texture too much, and it starts looking a little bit obvious as a repeating texture. So use some restraint here. Again, these are definitely not to be used as a crutch, but more as just a useful way to add a little bit of extra interest. So I want all these cool dark frog spots to be on her head and sort of really give her eyes some of those smaller spot details. And oh man, that looks so cool. Love the way that turned out. So just refining things, erasing them away. Obviously you don't want a skin texture going down where her clothes are, but once we have those where we like them, I've merged them all together, and I'm running the Paint Daubs filter. This takes away a little bit of that photographic quality, makes it look a little more like brush strokes, and just makes things look super cool. So just like that, we've added a ton of really cool interest with soft light photo textures. There's one more photo technique that I want to show you, but this time instead of soft light, we'll be using the multiply layer blending mode. I've got a really great photograph that I use. We're going to make some tattoos out of it. So let's go ahead and check that out. This is just this tapestry that I took a picture of, and it's got some really cool designs going on. It can often have a really cool alien look. So what I'm going to do is, similarly, we're just going to mask that out like we did before. So we create a selection by command clicking our silhouette, and once again, this photograph will not go outside the lines. It exists only on the interior of our figure here. So once we've got that where we want it, I hit Command I to invert it. I want it to be that kind of nice blue on white look. And then I've changed the blending mode to multiply. And as you can see, that sort of just darkens. It still lets the rendering show through, but it darkens everything. So that light blue is showing up only inside the figure, just like we want. And suddenly all these cool details from this tapestry are showing up where we want them. They look like these really cool tattoo designs. So that's what I'm using it for, both on that arm that we left without a sleeve and also a little bit on her abdomen here, just to make it look really cool and also just add a little bit of detail and interest where we need it. So a super cool way to add some detail. Also using multiply, we're going to do some face paint. So I've filled in a selection of the entire character, and I'm going to change that color to multiply using sort of a mustard green here. Now if I mask out everything, I fill in this new layer mask with black, we're not seeing this at all. But now we can use our brush to reveal this darker color. So if we paint white in a mask, it reveals it. So what that means is I can use white on this layer mask to kind of paint in a little bit of war paint, just something looking kind of cool. So I'm just sort of making up some cool alien looking design that she might have painted on her face, something that enhances her magic power, or make up any kind of cool backstory that you want. But this always makes characters look super wicked and adds a ton of interest. So a really neat step to save as part of your final polish. So trying this in a few places, I think I definitely like it on her face, but I don't think I'm going to keep it anywhere else. So you can always just paint black and hide it once again in your layer mask. So masks are a great way to kind of use a safety net and just take small steps. So as part of our final polish, we're going to start adding some secondary light sources. These are always a really cool time when your character starts to really pop. So I've got a light source established kind of behind her as well. You can see that bright glow kind of up in the background. So I want there to be a very bright light being cast behind her. It also has a really cinematic feel as part of your lighting design to give a really bright spotlight coming from behind somebody. It always makes them seem very epic and important. And that's definitely the feel I want to go for, that she's super powerful and is in some weird alien environment that she's harnessing power from, something like that. As long as you have a vague idea of the backstory, you don't really need many details. But adding this bright highlight to any area that's facing that light source behind her. So mostly just very thin lines, since all the edges that would be facing that way behind her are kind of rolling away towards that area. But we want to make sure to include these little kind of pin rim lights wherever they might occur. and just fattening things up a little bit on the shoulders where that light source would be really intense. And I'm going to add a little bit to the hair up top as well, just as if a lot of that was kind of pulling in from over the top, really starting to make her look very epic. Always cool to keep these on a layer too, because you can change the color of these secondary lights to anything that you want, and it actually can change a lot of the feel of the image. So for example, if I made these little reflected lights on her cheeks fiery orange, it would make her look like she was at a battlefield or something like that. Or I could have gone with a really eerie green to make it look all alien and strange, but going with muted stuff just to sort of fit in with the background here. But just remember, there's tons of information that you can include with these secondary lights, so take your time on them. Even though we're so close to the end, we want to make sure to really save our best work for our polish here, to make sure that we can turn a good illustration into a great illustration. So what I'm doing now is grouping everything and merging it all to one layer, and I'm just going to treat the edges. I've switched to the smudge tool, and I'm just smudging around everything and giving it a little bit of a blur. If your character's edges are very sharply defined or even look pixelated, it can totally kill the feeling of three-dimensionality and depth that we work so hard to create. So treating your edges with a little bit of smudging is a great way to give it a nice final treatment, make everything look super polished and as cool as it possibly can. But we're getting awfully close to a finished character here. I hope you've enjoyed this project a lot. I'm going to add a little bit of a color bloom, and we use that with a new layer, and we set that layer to lighten blending mode, lighten. And what that does is you can just create a little glow kind of coming over the top. Wherever your strongest light source is, it can actually be so bright that the colors sort of come over the foreground object. So that's what that bloom effect is, kind of a lens effect. Makes things look very epic and photographic, and a really nice way to add some final polish. But guys, with that and just a few more polish items, I think we just about have a finished character. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Let's check out our finished product. I'm loving how this one came out. Tons of great personality, a cool sense of movement, and her attitude and presence are exactly what I had hoped for. If you're following along, I hope you're pleased with your projects as well. Remember, this is just a quick sample project. For full step-by-step instruction on how to achieve these results, check us out at digitalpaintingstudio.com. So join us today, grab your stylus, and let's paint cool stuff.